In his luxurious flat, the elderly Mr. Adam sat before the fire with a frown upon his face. His secretary had gone home, taking away with her the dictated chapters of his book, his 20th novel. His 20th successful novel, he remembered with a smile that momentarily displaced the frown. How I started. He read the typed sentence before him. He remembered quite well what made him first begin to write. It had been due to a shock. A shock, some say, can bring out latent possibilities in the mind hitherto ignored. The shock had been the sudden, total loss of the comfortable fortune he had been brought up to expect. His guardian had played ducks and drakes with it. His anger against the guardian was of that bitter kind that could have killed. He still remembered, with a smile today, how he finally dismissed the idea from his mind. What's the use? He'd reflected bitterly. Even if I did murder him, the state would only murder me in return. I should be hanged. Who murders is murdered in his turn. What could he do to earn his living? He thought of many fields and callings, but realized he was trained for none. The choice of work, of something that he could do, troubled him obsessingly. He'd been walking for some time, and now he found himself wandering towards the waterfront of the ancient port that was his hometown. He thought of a cousin who had just gone to some job or other in China. Then, glancing up, his eye caught suddenly 5 little words, whose faded black letters shone in a patch of sunshine on the dull brick wall above his head. He stood and stared. It was merely the name of the alley, of course, yet thought took a new turn. A kind of enchantment stole over him. The 5 little words were almost a line of poetry. The Land of Green Ginger was what the young Mr. Adam read. Then he started down the twisting alley until his eye noted suddenly an old furniture shop with its queer wares overflowing onto the narrow pavement. A circular mirror, standing on a 3-legged pedestal nearly 6 feet high, reflected his figure as he moved idly towards the shop. He saw himself reflected, his smart flannel suit, his eyeglass, his straw hat with its Oxford colours. He also saw a bent, thin little old man with a skull cap on his head, standing among the shadows a few feet inside, beyond the dingy doorway. This figure now moved slowly towards him. "A fine piece, a perfect bit of glass, cheap too. It come from China 30 years ago." Adam entered the shop, the old man backing away before him. The interior was dark, and much larger than the small entrance promised. A single oil lamp revealed a series of deep, narrow rooms, cluttered up with stuff, among which the bent figure now set down the mirror carefully, for he had carried it in with him. In the dimness, the young man found his own reflection more attractive than before. It was softened. The wheezy voice was mentioning a price. Rather a trumpery price, considered Mr. Adam, a few shillings only. He went closer to examine it. He bent down, noticing an inscription cut deeply into the dark wood of the framework. It was in Chinese characters. He ran his fingers over them, then looked up to ask. "Who looks in me," translated the wheezy voice, "murders, and is murdered." The young man felt his body give an imperceptible twitch he was unable to suppress. His mind likewise gave a twitch. Was it uneasiness? It was, at any rate, surprise, while at the same time he was aware that something drew him, so that he found himself following the retreating figure, who now, still carrying the mirror with him, was on the threshold of the next long room. It was the 3rd extension of the premises, and it was considerably darker than the first 2 rooms. A chilliness hung in the fusty atmosphere. The place seemed lonely suddenly. Aware of a faint tremor in him, though not yet of anything more than that, he spoke in a brusque, almost an aggressive voice. "And what may such rubbish mean?" he inquired sharply. "Precisely what it says," came the wheezy voice. There was an unpleasant hush in it, and there came a look into the face that hardly invited merriment. Does it hold good? Mr. Adam challenged. If I buy the thing, for instance, do you mean to tell me that but you already before me? He could not finish the sentence. A shudder stopped his breath, and the voice died on his lips. While speaking, he had been looking, not into the old man's face, but into the mirror, where he still saw his own reflection. But it was not this that stopped his speech and froze his blood. It was something else he saw. With one wrinkled hand, the old shopman still clutched the pedestal, but in the other was an unsheathed knife. "So far it has held good," came his whisper down the long, dim room, and as he spoke, he tilted the mirror to a slightly different angle. The young man saw himself in the glass as before, but he now saw something else behind him too. It lay stretched upon the floor, motionless, crumpled dreadfully, its position not quite natural. One arm was twisted about the face at an angle not possible to life. In the narrow fairway of the room behind him, the room he had already passed, this pitiful, repulsive body lay. To stand where he now stood, the young man realized, he must actually have stepped over it. "You did that," he gasped, in a voice that emitted hardly any sound. "He looked in the mirror," came the whispered answer. "What do you expect?" And before that, he, in turn, "It works that way," the other gave back with an awful grin. Adam felt his body stiffen, yet the blood began to flow in tumult. He felt his fists clench tightly. With his eyes fixed on the shopman, and not leaving him for a single instant, he saw that the old man, letting go of the mirror, had suddenly begun to dodge. Light-footed he was, amazingly agile, quick, his movements convulsive, horribly alert. He dodged sideways, backwards, swift as a shadow round his customer, who watched the hideous dance with arrested muscles and with spellbound eyes. The knife gleamed and flashed. Adam made an effort that seemed to wrench his heart, and the muscles began to function again. His instinct of self-preservation woke. Instinctively he picked up a heavy iron mace from a teakwood table close beside him. With a strain he could just lift it. "It's up to me then now, is it?" he cried, his own feet shifting quickly. "I can defend myself," shrieked the shopman, dodging with incredible rapidity. "If that's any good to you," he yelled, shooting across the floor as an arrow flies, and brandishing his knife. Moved by a sudden power that surprised himself, the young man leapt towards the pirouetting horror. He made one bound. He swung his heavy mace. The great weapon crashed down upon the ancient skull, driving the cap deep into the split bone. The figure stopped abruptly, uttered a tiny squeak, crumpled, and lay like a great mutilated insect where it fell. It did not move again. "Murders and is murdered," the young man tried to scream, his voice, as in extreme nightmare agony, making no sound upon the air. "I've done you in, at any rate. Then it's my turn next, is it?" He turned swiftly, with the feeling that someone watched him from behind. A tall figure, sure enough, darkened the distant door into the street, the outline of a stranger who bent a little to examine something that stood upon the pavement just outside. The young man stared and stared. Though in semi-darkness himself, the outline was clearly defined in the evening light. But was it a stranger? He wore a smart flannel suit, a straw hat with Oxford colours. As he straightened up, an eyeglass became visible. Mr. Adam shot round and stared at the crumpled heap upon the floor at his feet. It was not the shopman. An electric shock flowed over him. What he stared down at was a neat flannel suit, a straw hat with Oxford colours. He shrieked. He raced headlong down the room, straight towards the street door, towards the stranger with the tall outline. And this tall outline now came gliding to meet him, very swiftly gliding, silently too, making no sound upon the boarded floor, just as he had seen his own reflected image gliding towards himself in the mirror before. Closer it came, and closer, something oddly, dreadfully familiar about it, something that he almost recognized. It came remorselessly nearer. He could not have stopped it if he tried. Like fate, his own fate, he must meet it. He could not avoid it, because he somehow welcomed it. He did not pause himself. He even moved faster, till there was but a foot between them. Terrified he was, yet at the same time his courage rose. They met. They slipped into one another. They emerged, and instantaneously, though this came about, he had time to recognize himself, and that same second to find himself standing on the pavement outside, gazing at a mirror on a high three-legged pedestal, while a little thin, bent old man faced him, wearing a skull-cap and rubbing his hands. It was the shopman, evidently, scenting a possible customer. "A fine piece," the old man wheezed, his eyes pierced like gimlets. "And cheap, too. It come from China 30 year ago." A wave of pleasant, even delightful emotion fluttered through the young man's heart as he bent to read an inscription carved in Chinese characters upon the wooden frame. He ran his finger over them, then looked up to ask. "To each," the wheezy voice translated, 10,000 futures, yet each must choose his own," and went on to explain how a learned gentleman had once kindly deciphered the words for him. Only the young man was no longer listening. He was staring intently at the upper part of the frame. "But the frame's empty," he cried out loud. "There is no mirror." And again that marvellous emotion passed fluttering across his heart. "It got broke," he heard the wheezy voice explaining. "Got broke on the voyage over. But it's easy put in again, me lord. A fine old piece." He mentioned a trumpery price, a few shillings merely. Young Mr. Adam bought it and took it home with him, and one evening he scribbled an account of his adventure in the land of green ginger. Later he wrote other, longer adventures too. He had inside him, it seems, some queer gift of scribbling imaginary, possibly imaginative adventures. A shock had brought it to the surface. Next morning, the elderly Mr. Adam dictated to his secretary a few commonplace paragraphs about how I started to write. "Send it to the editor," he told his secretary, "with a line to say I hope it is what he wants. He need not use it otherwise, of course." And as he dictated the paragraphs, his eye wandered to a mirror on a high three-legged pedestal, which oddly had no glass, and which the elderly Mr. Adam knew had never had one, nor ever would.
Matthew Marsh was reading The Land of Green Ginger by Algernon Blackwood. The story was abridged by Robin Brooks, and the producer was Clive Brill. Algernon Blackwood's Ghost Stories is a Pacificus production for BBC Radio. Next week's ghost story from Algernon Blackwood concerns Uncle Frank and the strange obsession and terror in his young nephew Jamie. That's The Transfer, next Sunday here on BBC Radio 4 Extra.
You're leaving the seventh dimension.
And so, as my time in this dimension draws to a close, don't forget that Doctor Who will be back next Saturday with another adventure from the Lost